Hi guys, it is Autumn Schuyler here, and today, as you can tell, we're going to be discussing some pretty heavy topics. You might be asking yourself why this is the video I decided to have be my return to this platform. And it's because of what happened to me that this platform has been hard to utilize, and we're going to get into that. So, we're just going to kind of go right along in. I do want to say that while I will be vaguely discussing certain triggering topics, I'm not going to go into any specifics about what occurred to me. I'm going to be using very blanket statements because I want this video to be something that survivors can come to and seek reassurance from, that their experience is valid, and if I were to use triggering language, that would defeat the purpose. And besides, this isn't the place for me to discuss specifics of what occurred to me. I do that enough in therapy. So, anyways, in the summer of 2020, I was in a situation where for a period of a few months, I was emotionally manipulated and abused, as well as sexually assaulted multiple times. And this all occurred from the same man. Now, throughout the course of this situation, this man introduced me to his friends. During the beginning process of the situation, I was definitely being manipulated and groomed. Now, some people hear that language being used and immediately think of minors. And while it is definitely the wordage used when discussing molestation, when grooming occurs, grooming can happen to anyone at any age. All that is required is a difference in power, whether actual or perceived. This man was older than I was and more emotionally stable than I was. Well, I thought they were. Clearly, to do what he did, you are not a stable person, but I perceived them as fully put together and successful and older, wiser, all of these things. And they would tell me how special I was, and how different I was, and how cool I was, and how they could see me being an actual friend. And so they introduced me to all of their friends. And things got complicated, as they are ought to do. So, you might be asking yourself, if this occurred not even last summer, but the summer before, why, if you were going to make a video, did it take you so long to make that video? When abuse or assault happens, it takes a very long time to process. And I've experienced this a few times before, where pretty much even any traumatic event, it can take a long time to realize the weight of it. Or even for the symptoms of PTSD to become something you're aware of. Because they might already be there and occurring, but you might not be aware that those are symptoms of PTSD that are occurring. You might just think something's not quite right, but you're not sure why. That's where I was. And it took me a while to realize, even though I had left the situation of my own accord, it took me a while to realize what had actually happened and the weight of it. I looked at the situation and for a while tried to think nothing of it, tried to not even think about it. I tried so hard to block out all of those memories that when they finally came flooding back, I was confused. And when I reevaluated some of the things I was beginning to re-experience and relive, as one does with PTSD, I was beginning to reevaluate whether or not I actually consented to the things that occurred, and began to realize I hadn't. There were a lot of things I was pressured into, and I would say no, and then would be pressured into saying yes. You see, consent, people think that it's tricky, but it's really not. I'm going to use an analogy, and it's it might seem like a childish analogy, but it can be very useful when you're trying to figure out what exactly consent is. So, say you have a cake. Beautifully made cake, whatever flavor you want, all that jazz. You have this cake, and you have a friend. Someone you're very close to, or maybe even somebody that you're in a relationship with, whatever the case. You have this cake. They ask for a slice. And you think, of course, at that time you want to give them that slice because it'll make them happy, it'll make you happy to make them happy, and you have so much cake that it seems like no big deal to give them that slice. But they come back. And still, you don't think anything of it. You think, okay, yeah, sure. You're enjoying the cake, I'm enjoying giving you the cake, this is perfect, this is great. I'm totally fine with the situation that's occurring. But they keep coming back. And then you look at the cake and you realize you only have a third left. So the next time they come back, you start being confused about whether or not you actually want to give them any more. They ask and you say, I don't know. Or not right now. Or ask me later, I'm not sure. But they keep asking and asking. And eventually you give them some more. You look at the cake and you think it's okay. It's fine, they can have a little more. So you keep giving them cake. You're still, when they come up, unsure at first, but they talk you into it. And so you give them that cake. They might even have already sliced the cake and put it on their plate and then begin asking you. And at that point you think, well, they already have the piece of cake. Whether I say yes or not really doesn't matter, so sure. And then you look at the cake and there's only half left. And you realize you don't want to give them any more. They've had enough. In your eyes, you don't want to give them any more right now. So they come up and you say no, very firmly. Not right now. And maybe at first they respect that. But they come back later. And they ask again. And you say no. And then they keep asking and asking and asking. And doing what they did before. Beginning to slice the cake. You say no, but they keep slicing and slicing. Maybe they'll stop for a little bit and come back. But they'll keep on going with that slice until they take it. And you realize they have it on their plate like they did before. Whether I say yes or no is inconsequential. So either you say yes or just go silent. And if you go silent, they'll take it as a yes. And that same pattern occurs until you look down and there's no cake left. They've taken it all. Now, looking at that situation, in the beginning, you wanted to give them that cake. You wanted to give them your consent. But the times when they were pestering you for that piece of cake, your consent, and you gave in. That was not really consent. Because did you really want to give it to them? No. You just wanted them to stop asking. You just wanted them to leave you alone. So that's the analogy that I use for consent. And that was what occurred with me. And eventually it got to a point where I would just freeze. And not really be 100% there, or just go along with it to, again, get it over with. So that's the analogy that I use. And it can be very helpful when someone's not entirely sure about what exactly constitutes as consent. Consent should always be an enthusiastic yes. It should always be 100% into the situation, not questioning. If someone begins to question, they're not really consenting. So again, that's what occurred with me, and that's, the story of that. So then in the aftermath, as I began to realize I hadn't really consented, and that a lot of situations I just gave in or stopped saying no because I knew saying no would do nothing, I began having more severe flashbacks, more severe panic attacks, and I began, every time I knew they would be coming over and hanging out, I began drinking a bit. It was about once a week that we would see them. So once a week I would drink a good amount throughout the entirety of them being there, and I would smoke and get myself stupid, so I wasn't really there. And then after they left, always that day, I'd be down for the count. And I would excuse it as a bad flare-up, or I'm just suddenly feeling depressed, and if, I just want to sleep. But I'd just lay there. And I'd cry. I knew why I wasn't feeling well at a certain point. In the beginning, I didn't recognize it, but then at a certain point, I did. And at that point, I felt trapped in this cycle, this pattern. They'd come over once a week, and I'd do what I had to do to get through that moment, and then crash and deal with the consequences. But it got to a point where I couldn't do that anymore. Luckily, with COVID and everything going on, obviously COVID is a terrible, horrible, awful thing. The only benefit that it had was that at one point when the rates were really high, we began only seeing them on virtual call. And so it gave me an out in some way. It was still very hard, and I would still crash, but it was easier to get through for me. Eventually I got to a point, even with it being over video, that I couldn't take it. It was like I had this box, and I was just stuffing all of my emotions and flashbacks and fears into this box, but the box is only so big, and it can only fit so much. So it exploded. And I began doing very negative coping strategies. I fell into some very bad habits that I have fallen into many times in the past when dealing with traumatic situations. So I had that going on, and it got to a point where I realized I couldn't do it anymore. It took me a long time to even tell my significant other about what happened, and we were all sorts of confused about what to do. I didn't want to make a big deal about it, because at that point I was trying to still convince myself it wasn't a big deal, and that I was upset for no reason, and that it was equally my fault, everything that had happened. Even though I knew deep down that it wasn't, and I knew that that wasn't rational, it still felt as though somewhere along the line I had been the one to make all of these mistakes, and that somehow it was my fault or I deserved it. I know now that's not the case. even though sometimes still that part of me exists. And this is very common with people that are victims of trauma. They blame themselves. There have been many times throughout the years where I've blamed myself for everything negative that's happened, because it's easier to blame yourself and take it out on yourself, because then you feel as though you're taking it out on the person responsible, even though you can't take it out on the person that hurt you. You can't take it out on them, so you take it out on yourself because you've convinced yourself you're equally responsible, so it's almost like you're taking it out on them. But really, you're just hurting yourself. And I was hurting myself. And I was hurting. Very badly hurting. People began to see that, and began to see me fall back from the friend group. And eventually, I tried to set up a hangout session that excluded him. And people were confused and upset. And I understood at the time, and I even understand now the reaction they had at that time. Everything that came after is a different story. But eventually someone reached out to me, and they were very upset about me not inviting them, and they were asking why I was cutting them out of my life. And so I told them in the very vaguest of terms that I was traumatized by things that had happened in the past. And they kept asking questions and asking questions. And I would answer them very vaguely. And then they told everyone without my knowledge, and I found out, and I freaked out. At the time, they tried to say they had good intentions, and that they were trying to protect me and protect other people. Only the actions they took later on kind of counteract what they said. But anyways, that's what was said, and that's what happened. So then I realized everybody already knows very basic things, and everybody's asking me questions, so I gotta tell them, from my own point of view, what happened. Because they're asking for proof and evidence that I don't have. The only evidence that I have is my experience. So I did what I never wanted to do, which was tell them. And I didn't mince words, and I told them every detail. And they were supportive for a few days, until they talked to my abuser, and he said he didn't do it. And that was all it took. In fact, he then flipped the narrative and told them all that I was an abuser. And I don't know in what way he meant that, but he convinced them that I had abused him in some way. Again, I'm still not sure in what way he had told them, and that I was abusing and am abusing my current significant other. And almost everyone believed him, and believes him to this day. And the sad thing is, even though such a large majority of people experience things similar to what I experience, one of the most common reactions of people close to both individuals is to deny that it ever happened and to not believe the victim. They try and pull this false narrative that so many women lie nowadays. It's not the case. And it felt as though they never even took time to consider if I was supposedly lying, what at all they thought I was trying to gain. Because I knew going into this situation I would lose everyone. I knew. The man who hurt me is a narcissist. And he is very charming. I mean, it took a while for me to believe and realize that I had been abused, because even when I would bring up being uncomfortable with things he did in the moment, he would convince me otherwise, that they were fine, even though they weren't fine. taken me a long time to get to a place where I could talk about this. And so I got to that place and I lost so many. And that was the biggest slap in the face I could have gotten. It was like he had won. It still feels like that a lot of days. I try and remind myself that I'm still here. And that's what shows he didn't win. Because I'm still here, I'm still living, and I'm still trying in whatever small way I can to raise some sort of awareness about abuse that occurs in my own small way, but still, some days it's hard to see that narrative and see that as truth. I've still been very active on Instagram. And so that might be confusing as to why I haven't posted here. This is a platform in which I can't censor who sees. And I know it's a very good chance that my abuser will watch this. That it's a good chance the people who took his side will watch this. And so it's prevented me from posting anything for a very long time because I didn't want them to see me. On other platforms, I could block their account and then also block any other account made by that same set of, like email, or I think even the same phone it blocks on Instagram. That they won't be able to see you. Any other accounts made by them won't be able to see what you post. So I felt safe. I feel safe there. This feels very hard and very scary. And like I'm inviting them to judge me again. One of the hardest parts is trying to pick up all the pieces and move on. I've had nightmares every single night for months. And sleep paralysis and nightly hallucinations. Not every night, but just hallucinations that have occurred at night. Things related to what I experienced. And my fears. And it's hard. The effects of abuse and assault. They last a while. Some things will never go away. And I know that, and I'm trying to come to terms with that. That this, to some degree or another, will always be a part of me. And will always be something that affects me. So I'm trying. This video is my first step at trying to regain myself. Regain what it feels like I've lost. Along the way, along the journey to being okay with something that's so not okay. It feels like the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And I've done this before. I dealt with things in my past similar in a sense to what's occurring now. And for some reason, this feels so much harder. My trust in people has diminished a lot because of the response that I experienced. It made all of my fears fully realized, because this is what I was terrified of, and this is what happened. but I'm trying just to be okay. Sometimes just being okay is the best thing you can do. Because it's the only thing you can do. It's the only thing you have control of, yourself, and how you handle the situation that you're presented with. And I handled it terribly for a while. But I got help. I went into group therapy for a couple of months. I graduated. And now I'm here. And I'm trying to deal with the core. But it's hard. It's like draining an abscess. You have to cut it open and squeeze it out, all of this gross disgustingness that you just want to ignore. You keep getting into this pattern of ignoring because the abscess keeps filling up because you never get out the core. And I'm trying. And I hope that this video is a step in the right direction. And I hope that if survivors come across this video, it lets them know that they aren't alone and that all of the things they're experiencing, sadly, come with the territory. People don't want to believe that someone they've known for years could really be a monster. And so that's how they cope. They plug their ears and call you a liar because you didn't document everything that had ever been said to you or record what was said to you or done to you. That because you didn't get this documentation of what occurred, it was a lie. And that's how a lot of people cope when they're presented with a hard reality. And this is a very tough pill to swallow, and I recognize that. But it's been really hard for me too. But I'm getting there. And if you or someone you know has ever been in a place similar to me, which it's very possible you have. I mean, 97% of women are harassed or assaulted at some point in their life, and I believe 1 in 6 men. So if you've been where I am, you know. And I hope that knowing you're not alone in the experiences you had is helpful. I hope me posting this is in some way helpful and can give someone some sort of solace and relief that they're not crazy and that people not believing them doesn't mean that they're a bad person and that that's what made it easier for people to not believe you. It just means that you were assaulted and people that weren't there don't want to believe someone they knew could do it. And I know that someday the nightmares will go away. They've gone away before. And I hope that dealing with this core, taking the steps necessary, will bring me to where I need to be to move on. Because I've been stuck in this for a while. But I do think this is the first step. So thank you guys for sticking along through this I don't even know if I want to say journey. But whatever you want to call it. Thank you for listening. I'm going to put some links down below to some more information, as well as to some organizations that you can donate to, or again, learn some information about assault. Because it's important. And it's something that there is no rule book to dealing with. There's no guide. It affects every person differently, but there are always similarities. So thank you. And I'll see you in the next one.